good fortune of actually being the chair of the Lake Superior Technical Committee, which is the group of fisheries professionals that's run under the auspices of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission that's responsible for the co-managed fisheries around Lake Superior. So the talk I'm giving, and my very first slide, allocates the apportionment of thanks I need to give to people, because most of the data and information I'm providing are not mine. It's from other members of our technical committee. And so there's a lot of names on that first slide, and you probably won't get a chance to see them, but they're the people who did all the work that went into the talk that I'll be giving. My talk is basically split into two main areas. One is looking at food web and energy transfer, mostly from a fisheries perspective. So like a few of the other people mentioned yesterday, I wasn't exactly sure what I was supposed to be talking about today, and it kind of changed a little bit over time. And so the first half of the talk is more the biotic integrity part, and then the last half is looking at the focus on fish communities. And I do have one slide on where the land priorities and fisheries intersect, and that's kind of in the middle of my talk. The data I'll be presenting today were collected, a lot of it was from the USGS, so collected on the Kai that we saw yesterday, the vessel that's capable of doing lake-wide surveys. So there they do acoustic surveys and trawl surveys, and then on the other parts of the lake, agencies do some acoustic surveys as well, but then more traditional netting, things like gill nets and trout nets. Now we're getting to the point where we have to do
doing good.
Before I talk too much. I guess the last thing I can talk about, actually I do have a slide on the lake and the physical properties of the lake that I can talk about. I don't need to spend much time with this group about why Lake Superior is important and special, but from a fisheries perspective, there are a couple points I need to make. First of all, a lot of what we heard about yesterday, I would consider, or we consider from the fisheries perspective, to be kind of the really inshore areas, embayments, areas less than 15 meters deep. Mostly what we deal with is deeper areas. So areas that we consider near shore are from 15 to about 80 meters in depth, and then we have offshore areas that are greater than 80 meters in depth. And those parts of the lake aren't as impacted by many of the processes we heard yesterday. Lake Superior is actually a pretty inhospitable place for most fishes. So our offshore and nearshore fish communities are really simple, and we don't have those same impacts of invasive fish or invasive species in general that we see in the lower Great Lakes. And I would like to claim responsibility as a manager for protecting the lake, but really we had nothing to do with it. It's just the lake protects itself. And so, again, from the fisheries side, we're dealing with mostly native fishes. There are a couple of invasives that I'll be talking about, but we're in relatively good shape compared to the other lakes because of the physical nature, the physical protective nature, the inhospitable nature for fish generally in the lake. Keep going? I could. So my next slide, which actually will flip by, is a brief schematic of the Lake Superior food web. That was provided to me from Brian Matthias, who is a postdoc in Tom Rovick's lab, that will be speaking about food web stuff for 5 minutes. I feel bad for him because I'm taking a lot more than that. And that slide shows that there are a couple of different pathways that energy is transferred around the lake. There's benthic pathway, and then there's a pelagic pathway, and then we have both nearshore and offshore components of that energy transfer. And in the lower parts of the food web, what you would be seeing is that there's pretty much linear funneling upwards towards the upper trophic levels, and it's not until you get to the fish layers that you start to see crossovers between the benthic and pelagic areas. And because of that, it's the fish that are actually responsible for moving around a lot of that energy from offshore to nearshore areas and from benthic to pelagic areas. And so then I move into 3 slides that I really would like to show you, because they look at which fish do that and the mechanisms by which that happens. So I think I want to pause just for a minute. It's okay. So there are a bunch of places where the LAMP and fisheries priorities intersect. So the 2015 to 2019 LAMP had a number of science priorities, and then it had actions to meet those science priorities. And so from a fisheries perspective, I think some of the science priorities were better understanding of the lower food web, lower trophic levels, support for species where we have rehabilitation efforts ongoing, identifying species of conservation concern, and then some of the actions that have occurred in the land to support fisheries include habitat protection. So again, it's interesting from a fisheries perspective, the places where we manage fish, what we call the nearshore and offshore areas, that's where very few species actually live. A lot of the fish are restricted to inshore areas, so embayments, tributaries, coastal wetlands, areas that we don't do a lot of work, but areas that are certainly under a lot more anthropogenic pressure. And so the LAMP is protecting some of those critical habitats where the majority of the fish biodiversity resides, protecting habitats, rehabilitating places like the Buffalo Reef work, and then supporting our rehab plans for things like brook trout, Lake Sturgeon. So that would be kind of the LAMP intersection with the fisheries world. So I was presented with 3 slides from Owen Gorman about how fish move energy around the lake. So our food web interactions with fishes. And so in the offshore zone, we have a few things that undergo what's called diel vertical migration. So these are fish and invertebrates that go down really deep during the day, as deep as 800 feet or even 1,000 feet. And then those fish actually rise up near the surface in the evening. They follow mysis, which is their main prey, off the bottom of the lake. And once they get up to those higher levels of the lake, then they get eaten by predatory fish, which then can take some of that energy that's transferred from the bottom back to the surface, and so it isn't lost to the depths. And there are other key fish, things like Cisco, which spend most of their summer out in the pelagic part of the lake, and then they eat plankton out there, and then they transfer that energy back into inshore areas in the fall. So Cisco move in to nearshore, inshore areas in the fall, they spawn, and they leave behind billions and billions of eggs and larvae, which are then consumed by many other things. So again, this energy shunt from offshore to inshore areas. And then lastly, we have a number of fish that do diel bank migrations on a daily basis. They move up and down the slope of the lake, again, mostly at night. So during the day, things are pretty quiet. At night, everything happens. And you have all these animals moving off the bottom, either up the bank, up in the water column, or across the water column. And that's how fish effectively shunt this energy around the lake. So that was 3 slides. That was pretty good. All right, now I'm going to fly through things. Just because I talked about it. I will show this one though, because this is just what I was last talking about. I won't put so much work into this slide. I thought it was kind of cool. So during the day, like I mentioned, everything is pretty much hugging the bottom, other than Cisco, which drop out of the photic zone. So they're still down just to the edge where light reaches. And then at night, the whole lake changes. This is why we do hydroacoustics at night. It's because when the fish become available to our hydroacoustic efforts. So first thing that happens is mysis comes off the bottom up to feed on plankton and the higher part of the water column, and then everything else moves out to eat those layers, those concentrated layers of plankton and those microinvertebrates like mysis and diaperia. So things like even Ciscoette, which is a deep water form of lake trout, come from extremely deep depths to follow Kai, which is a deep water Cisco form up. And so that's kind of how energy moves off the bottom up into the water column and gets shifted around. All right, so now we're going to talk about the Lake Superior fish community and where we stand. So this is data from the USGS from Mark Vinson. We actually saw this yesterday. And this is the long-term crayfish index that we use to assess how well we're doing in terms of the crayfish community in Lake Superior. So what you can see here is that during the early part of the time series, it was pretty low, and then during the mid-1980s, we had this huge spike in crayfish availability, and since then, we've had this steady decline to the point where around 2010, we had some of the absolute lowest records of crayfish abundance that we've seen in this long-term record. So what is going on here? What's really going on is we have lost a lot of these Cisco species, at least the height of these Cisco species. So there's 4, I should mention, there's 4 ecomorphotypes or 4 species of Cisco on the lake. It's a little confusing because one of them is actually called Cisco. So this is the shallow water planktivore, the one that transfers energy from offshore to nearshore areas. This is CSMI data. The other thing I wanted to mention actually is that I tried to highlight where we had data from CSMI surveys. I tried to highlight that in the top right of these slides. So starting in the first two CSMI sampling for offshore fishes, Cisco were pretty consistent, a little bit of a drop in 2011, and then we saw this huge decrease in our last CSMI survey in 2016. Now Cisco is an important commercial species as well, so we have data not only for the CSMI, but we have data annually from commercial fisheries and other metrics across the years. Our best fisheries tool is the development of something called a statistical catch-at-age model. So this was the first model that was ever developed for Cisco. This is from Thunder Bay Harbor up near Thunder Bay, Ontario. And what you can see here with this model is the number of female spawners has gone down by about 2/3, which is about the same that we saw in that CSMI survey, particularly over the last 10 years. And correspondingly, we have this large increase in fisheries exploitation rate in the last 10 years or even the last 5 years. So we're at the point now where we are starting to have to implement quota reductions for Cisco across the lake. What is happening with not only Cisco, but all of the Ciscos is that we haven't really had any strong recruitment events for a long time. So if you remember back to that first large long-time crayfish graph that I put up, we saw this spike in crayfish starting in about the mid-1980s. Well, that was driven by these Ciscos. And so in 1984, we had this, out of nowhere, we had this huge recruitment event for Cisco. It was unexpected. And then we had this follow-up of 3 strong recruitment events in a row in the late 1980s, early 1990s. The last decent Cisco recruitment event occurred in 2003. These fish can live over 20 years, but it's, I won't say it's unusual, but at that point they start to really die to senescence. And so we haven't had a Cisco year class for over 15 years now. And so the fish that are still being captured in these commercial fisheries are actually part of these year classes. We've had really nothing supporting them for the last 15 years. So that's why we're seeing these declines in Cisco. We also see it in the deep water Cisco form of kai, again, about a 2/3 loss. This is our most important offshore planktivore. This is the fish that undergoes DBM, recycling energy from the bottom back to the surface of the lake. Rainbow smelt is an invasive fish. It's the only one other than sea lamprey that plays an important role in the Lake Superior fish community. You can see it's probably the most important planktivore other than Cisco in the lake. You can see a little bit of a different pattern here. You see an increase in abundance and a little bit of change in biomass over the 3 CSMI surveys. This is a little bit discongruent. We can have higher numbers in 2016 but lower biomass, and that's because actually smelt are getting smaller over time. So over the last 4 decades, if people remember the good old days of smelt fishing, you could go out to the stream and catch some pretty large smelt. Those fish were 2 or 3 years old. We don't see those fish anymore. Smelt are reproducing at age 1 in Lake Superior now, so even though we have more of them, they contribute much less biomass than they did. We also have important benthic prey fishes. The primary ones are 3 species of sculpin that kind of distribute themselves along the depth gradient in the lake. Again, you can see a very similar but worrisome trend here of declining abundance and declining biomass, particularly in that 2016 survey. So everything we're seeing with our crayfish is consistent with the USGS bottom trawl and then what we're seeing in these CSMI, these more intensive CSMI survey years. Do we have any good news stories in the fish community? Well, maybe a few. Lake whitefish, this is a graph from Ben Michaels from Bliffwick. It starts back in 1867, believe it or not, and then runs through to present day. So we had pretty low catches of lake whitefish for a while, and then once the other lakes were fully exploited, we had this surge in interest in Lake Superior right around the turn of the century. Keep going? Yes, keep going. Then they were heavily overfished. Sea lamprey came into the lake and kept them at low levels in the 1930s and 40s. And then as the lake generally recovered with improvements in sea lamprey control, whitefish numbers rebounded, and then we had a pretty steady fishery for almost 40 years. We've had similar levels of harvest around Lake Superior. So kind of a good news story, but lately there are some worrisome trends again. So this is a graph of effort in order to catch the same number of fish. We're seeing
particularly in the last 10 years or so, a decline in catch per unit effort, meaning that the commercial fishermen, even though they're harvesting the same number of whitefish, they're having to work harder to catch those fish. And again, we're seeing declines in recruitment. Unlike Cisco, whitefish are the same genus as Cisco, so you would expect that they would have similar recruitment dynamics. We still are seeing some small year classes produced, but certainly not as large as the year classes that we saw through the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s. So we are seeing declines in recruitment for this species as well. What we think the solution or the answer to all of our problems is actually what's been happening with lake trout. So lean lake trout, this is the form of lake trout. Again, we have lake trout diversity in the lake. There's 4 ecomorphotypes. The lean one is the one that is mainly fished commercially and recreationally. It's found at that sort of near shore depth that I talked about, 15 to 80 meters. I wish I had a simpler graph to share because this is pretty confusing, but unfortunately this is how we assess our fish by management zone. So this goes through Ontario West, 3 fisheries management units in Minnesota, 2 in Wisconsin. There are actually 8 in Michigan, even though one's missing here, and then an Eastern Ontario zone. So we have a standardized netting survey that we've been doing, Don mentioned it yesterday, for almost 50 years in each of these areas. And this shows just kind of the last 30 years or so of data for lake trout. And it's easiest to see in these Michigan zones, so Michigan 2, 5, 6, 3 to some degree. But at some point in time in these zones, this is where we saw recovery, full recovery of lean lake trout earliest. And so by the early 2000s, we had kind of recovered lake trout fully, and then we started to see these declines in numbers. This didn't happen synchronously across the lake in all zones. So in Minnesota, these dashed lines actually indicate stocked fish. So early on, there were more stocked fish in Minnesota waters, and then you see this resurgence of lake trout more recently in the later years. So it happened later in Minnesota than in other parts of the lake. But in general now, we think that in almost all areas, lean lake trout have fully recovered and reached carrying capacity. And because of that, they are driving these reductions that we see in the crayfish community. Why do we think this? Well, we're seeing consistent declines in growth. So one of our metrics is the size of lake trout at age 7. And you can see that in most of these units, we're seeing declines over time as prey resources get more scarce and there are more and more lake trout in the lake. We see not quite the same trend in Cisco lake trout, so this is the offshore, the deep water form of lake trout. Here we've been doing surveys since the mid-1990s, and we really haven't seen any changes in Cisco abundance across the lake over time. However, we have seen these growth changes that we've seen in the lean form and Ciscoids as well. So I really wanted to emphasize how important lake trout was to us as a predator in the lake. It is our keystone predator. It's the top of the food chain, other than sea lamprey, which I am going to mention a little bit later. It supports important recreational and commercial fisheries. And as I mentioned, we think it's fully rehabilitated, at least in most areas. And this is why we're seeing these declines in the crayfish community. So we're able to sleep at night by telling ourselves this. If we just looked at the crayfish, we would probably not be. So we recognize, however, that this is just a hypothesis, and so we are continuing to watch what's happening with the rest of the community pretty closely. I also mentioned that they have this high evolutionary diversity, and hopefully this works. This is a nice video provided to me by Steve Chong from the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. Good. So these are brown whitefish. This is actually the Dog River. The Dog River is a small tributary that comes into Lake Superior up on the Pakasaw coast. And if you look out in this area, you will start to see fish swimming by in the deeper water that have very white fins. Those are lake trout. That's a pink salmon that just swam by. And these lake trout come into the Dog River every year to spawn. It's our only known remnant lake trout spawning population that still uses a river. So hopefully you'll see one swim by here. I'm still hoping. There we go. So there's some lake trout out there. These fish have all been pit tagged. They have pit tag readers in the river, so they know that the same fish come back year to year. And then these Menominee come in and eat their eggs, which is what fish do to each other. I'm going to end my talk by looking at a few species that are not found in the areas we normally sample. So these are more what we consider inshore fish. First is coastal brook trout. We have, like many of the CSMI projects, we have annual surveys for coasters in a few areas, but during a CSMI year, we try to make a special effort and add more areas. So even though this isn't, I guess, technically a CSMI project in the eyes of the LAMP, we view it as that as part of our technical committee because we put extra effort in on CSMI years. So all I want to show with these, the next couple species for coastal brook trout and lake trout is that we're seeing positive signs. So this is just 3 years of data from this electrofishing survey, including 2016 is the CSMI year. But we're seeing, especially in the core areas, so on Isle Royal, Nippigan Bay, off of Grand Portage, we're seeing increases in the number of brook trout as part of these electrofishing surveys. Oh, I'm going to go to the next slide first because I reordered them and this is the old version. So for lake sturgeon, this was our real CSMI project, so this work wouldn't be done across the lake without the help from CSMI. So here we are assessing for juvenile lake sturgeon off the mouth of all of the historic tributaries. We only have 2 data points. 2016 is the dark point, 2011 is the light point. If you really don't look too closely, you might not notice that we caught less sturgeon in 2016 almost everywhere. We blame this on the high water levels and the flooding that occurred, especially along the South Shore in 2016. But it does point out with a species like lake sturgeon that's as long-lived as it is and only getting data every 5 years that I will either be retired or maybe dead by the time we have a nice graph to share here. But hopefully it would show recovery of lake sturgeon. We do have some longer-term gillnet data sets that people have been collecting on lake sturgeon for a number of years in a few places, and they almost all show this slow but steady increase in numbers over time. And so we generally think things are good for lake sturgeon, but we don't have that lake-wide picture yet. We'll need a few more rounds of CSMI sampling to get it. The last CSMI project I wanted to talk about was early detection and monitoring for invasive species. Now I know the research that set up the monitoring program was done right here at the EPA lab. It was then taken by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and implemented around the lake. Again, it's one of those things where we have annual surveys that are occurring in Duluth Harbor, Thunder Bay Harbor, and the Upper St. Mary's River. But during the CSMI year, we were able to add a number of high-value sites to the sampling. So these red circles are the highest areas of risk based on the number of ships that visit and the number of ballast that's discharged. So I just wanted to show that the increasing effort that we're able to put in due to the CSMI work. And my last data slide is looking at sea lamprey. So I didn't want people to leave here without remembering how important sea lamprey control was to the Lake Superior fish community. Sea lamprey, we measure their performance of the control program 2 different ways. One is looking at the numbers of sea lamprey, and the other is the wounding rate of sea lamprey on lake trout. And you can see that, I'm going to start with wounding because it's actually in the best condition. This black line is our target of 5 wounds per lake trout of a given size. You can see that we bounce around, but generally we're just above target. However, the last few years, this is our target for adult sea lamprey of just over 12,000 fish. You can see that unfortunately we're up way higher than that in the range of 60 or 70,000 sea lamprey the last few years in the lake. And without a strong control effort for sea lamprey, much of the gains that I've been talking about in terms of recovery of the fish community, we would not be seeing. And I just wanted to remind people of that. So my last slide is just a quick summary. The last bullet is probably the most important one. I know we're a little behind. So the Fisheries Agency support of CSMI projects has really improved our knowledge in many areas that we normally would not be able to collect data on. I tried to stress that during my talk today. And I think we've also been able to advance land goals with that effort as well. So, thank you.